They were told it was a chance, a way out, a second beginning somewhere far from the noise and pressure of the cities they were born into, and for many of them that promise was the only thing that made the departure bearable. Because in the mid-19th century, places like New York, Boston and Philadelphia were overcrowded to a degree that is difficult to fully grasp today. Entire families living in single dark rooms with almost no light, children growing up surrounded by smoke, disease and constant instability, the streets filled with noise, shouting, movement, survival, and in that world childhood did not feel like childhood. It felt like endurance, like waiting for something to change without knowing if it ever would, and when people began to arrive with a different kind of message, something that sounded like opportunity, something that sounded like escape, it spread quickly. They said there were places where the air was clean, where there was space, where children could grow properly, where life could be different. And for families who had nothing left to give, that idea became something they could not ignore, even if it meant letting go, even if it meant sending a child away with no guarantee of return. And the process itself did not look violent. It did not feel like force. It was organized, structured, almost calm. Children were gathered in groups, their names written down, their ages estimated, their appearance noted in detail, as if they were being prepared not just for travel, but for transfer. And some of them did not fully understand what was happening. Some believed they would come back, some believed they were going somewhere temporary, and others simply followed instructions because there was no alternative. And when the moment came, they were led toward the trains, small bags in their hands or nothing at all, surrounded by unfamiliar adults, the sound of metal and steam filling the air, and as they stepped inside the train cars, that was the moment something shifted. Not visibly, not dramatically, but quietly. A separation that did not yet feel permanent, but already was, because once the train began to move, everything behind them started to disappear. Not just the streets, not just the buildings, but the only life they had ever known. They were not told where the train would truly take them, only that it was somewhere better, somewhere quieter, somewhere far from the streets that had already taken too much from them. And for many of them, that was enough, because when your world is small and heavy and every day feels the same, even an unclear promise can feel like a way out. So they followed instructions, they stayed in line, they waited when they were told to wait, and one by one they were moved forward, not pushed, not forced, just guided with a calm that made everything feel ordinary, almost routine. And that was what made it easier, because nothing about it looked dangerous, nothing about it felt urgent. It looked organized, controlled, almost kind, and that quiet normality was stronger than fear. The train itself did not arrive with drama. It did not feel like a turning point. It came slowly, with the weight of metal and steam, as if it had done this many times before, and maybe it had. Standing there like just another part of the system, not something to question, not something to resist, just something that existed, and the children looked at it not with fear, but with uncertainty, because they had never been told to be afraid. They had been told to trust, and trust is easier to follow than doubt when you are that young. There were no goodbyes in the way we imagine them now, no final speeches, no moments that felt important enough to remember forever, just small, quiet separations that happened too quickly to fully understand. A hand let go, a step forward, a name called, and suddenly the distance between what was familiar and what was coming next became something real, something physical, but still not something they could fully grasp, because no one had explained it in a way that would make it feel final. Inside the train, everything became slower, quieter, more contained. The movement of the outside world replaced by the rhythm of the tracks, steady and indifferent, and the children sat where they were placed, not asking questions, not demanding answers, because they had already learned that questions did not change outcomes, and slowly, without any clear moment of realization, something shifted, not in the world around them, but inside them. A quiet understanding that whatever this was, it was not temporary, even if no one had said it out loud. And somewhere between the departure and the distance, between the last familiar street and the first unknown landscape, the idea of going back stopped being real, not because it was impossible, but because it was never part of the plan to begin with, and that was the part no one had explained, not clearly, not honestly, not in a way a child could understand. The train did not arrive in a way that felt important. There was no announcement, no clear signal that something had changed. It simply slowed, then stopped, and the doors opened as if this was just another ordinary pause in a long journey. But outside, the world was already different, quieter in a way that felt unfamiliar, more open, less crowded, and yet somehow more exposed, because there was nowhere to disappear into. No tight streets, no walls close enough to feel like protection, just space, and people waiting within it. They were not welcomed in the way children imagine being welcomed. There were no smiles waiting for them, no arms reaching out with warmth, just adults standing at a distance, observing, not rushing forward, not speaking much, simply watching, as if what mattered was not who the children were, but what they might become. And one by one, they were asked to step forward, not all at once, not in groups, but individually, separated even from those they had just travelled with. The process quiet, controlled, and deliberate. It did not feel like a moment of choice, not to the children, because no one explained it that way, but to the adults standing there, it was exactly that. A moment to look, to assess, to decide. And the way they did it was not loud or dramatic. It was subtle. A glance, a short exchange, a gesture, and then a decision made without explanation, and the child would move, sometimes towards someone, sometimes away, sometimes simply to another place in the line, without understanding what had just happened or why. Some children were chosen quickly, almost immediately, as if something about them had already answered the question before it was even asked. Others waited longer, standing still, trying not to move, trying not to be noticed too much or too little, caught in a space where being seen mattered, but being understood did not, and the longer they stood there, the more the silence changed. It became heavier, more present, no longer just quiet, but something that pressed against them from all sides. And in that silence something became clear in a way that no explanation could have made clear before. This was not a journey that would end and return them to where they came from. This was a separation that would continue quietly, without a clear moment of finality, but with consequences that would last far longer than they could understand in that moment. Because what was happening here was not temporary. It was not a pause. It was a redirection of their lives, decided in a way that did not require their understanding, only their presence. The choices that were made in those quiet moments did not reveal themselves immediately, not in a way the children could understand at first, because what followed did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, in places that felt ordinary on the surface, farms, houses, small towns that looked calm and stable compared to where they had come from. And for some, that first impression held. There was food, there was space, there was work that made sense, and a routine that felt structured, and in those cases the promise they had been given seemed, at least in part, to be real. But for others, the reality shifted in a different direction, not suddenly, not with a clear moment where everything changed, but gradually through small differences that became harder to ignore, expectations that were not explained, responsibilities that felt heavier than they should have been, and a silence around them that was not peaceful, but indifferent, where what they felt did not matter as much as what they could do. They were not always treated as children, and sometimes not even as individuals, but as something closer to a function, a role to be filled, work to be done, tasks to be completed without question. And while there were no rules spoken out loud that defined this completely, it became clear in the way they were addressed, in the way they were expected to respond, in the way mistakes were handled, quietly but firmly, leaving little space for resistance or misunderstanding. Some adapted quickly, learning how to move within this new structure, how to meet expectations without drawing attention, how to exist without questioning too much. Because questioning did not change outcomes. It only made things more difficult, and survival, once again, became less about where they were and more about how they behaved within it. Others struggled in ways that were less visible but no less real, holding on to small fragments of what they remembered, trying to connect the life they had come from with the one they now found themselves in, and finding that the space between those two realities could not easily be bridged, because no one around them shared that memory, and without shared memory even the past begins to feel uncertain. And over time, something deeper changed, not just in their surroundings, but in their understanding of themselves, because when a life is redirected without explanation, when choices are made for you without your voice, the question is no longer where you are going, but who you are allowed to become, and for many of them that question was never fully answered, only lived day after day in ways that were quiet, controlled, and difficult to see from the outside. What happened to the children after those first days was not something that could be summarized in a single outcome, because there was no single path, no uniform experience that defined what this system truly was, and that is what made it harder to understand, because from the outside it could still look like something organized, something structured, something that had purpose. But inside it, the reality was uneven, unpredictable, and often invisible to anyone who was not living through it. Some children did find stability in places where they were given food, shelter, and a role that allowed them to grow into something resembling a life, not the one they had imagined, but one that functioned, one that could be sustained, and in those cases the system could be described as working, at least on the surface, because it produced an outcome that looked acceptable, even successful, if you only measured it by survival. But that was only part of the story, and it was the part that was easier to show, easier to talk about, because it justified the process, it gave it meaning, it allowed those who supported it to point to results and say that something good had been done, that something necessary had taken place, and that without it things might have been worse. For others, however, the system revealed something far less stable, far less controlled, because once the children were placed, once they were no longer visible as a group, once they became part of individual households or isolated environments, the structure that had guided them there no longer followed them in the same way, and what replaced it depended entirely on where they had been sent. There were no consistent standards, no uniform expectations that protected them equally, no mechanism that ensured they were treated as they had been promised, and while some were integrated into families in ways that resembled care, others were absorbed into routines that were far more demanding, where the line between help and labour became unclear and over time disappeared entirely. In those environments, childhood did not disappear all at once. It faded, slowly, through repetition, through expectation, through the quiet understanding that what was required of them was not temporary, not something they would grow out of, but something they were expected to carry, day after day, without question, without resistance, and without the language to describe what was happening to them. And because there was no single moment where this became undeniable, no clear point where someone could say that something had gone wrong, it continued, not hidden, but unnoticed, existing in plain sight, within homes, within fields, within routines that looked ordinary to those who were not part of them, and that was what made it so difficult to confront, because it did not look like failure, it looked like function. Some children adapted completely, becoming part of the structure that had absorbed them, learning how to meet expectations, how to avoid conflict, how to exist within a system that did not require their voice, only their compliance, and in doing so, they survived. But survival in that context did not always mean preservation of who they had been. Others carried something different, something quieter but heavier, a sense that what had happened to them had not been a transition, but a replacement, not a continuation of their lives, but a redirection that had erased parts of it, and without a shared memory, without others who remembered what came before, even their own past began to lose its clarity. And in the absence of that clarity, the question that remained was not whether the system had helped or harmed, but whether it had understood the cost of what it was doing, because what it changed was not only where the children lived, but how they saw themselves, how they understood belonging, identity and choice, concepts that are difficult to define even with explanation and nearly impossible to form without it. What remains difficult to measure is not how many of them survived, or even how many of them found some form of stability, but how many of them were changed in ways that could not be easily seen, because the system that moved them was not designed to follow them. It was designed to relocate them, and once that relocation was complete, the responsibility became diffuse, spread across distance, across households, across lives that no longer connected back to where they began. There were records, but not always complete, names written down, ages estimated, destinations listed in ways that suggested order. But those records did not capture what happened over time. They did not reflect the daily reality of those who had to adapt, who had to reshape themselves within environments that were never explained to them. And because of that, the official version of what this system was remained cleaner, simpler, easier to defend than the lived experience of those inside it. In later years, when some of those children became adults and tried to reconstruct what had happened to them, the process was fragmented, memories that did not fully align, gaps where details should have been, uncertainty about timelines, about places, about people. And this was not because nothing had happened, but because too much had happened without being marked, without being acknowledged as something that needed to be remembered in a structured way. Some were able to reconnect parts of their past, finding names, locations, sometimes even people, but those moments did not restore what had been lost. They only revealed how much of it had become distant, how much of it no longer existed in a form that could be returned to, because time had moved forward in one direction, and the system that had moved them had not preserved a path back. Others never found that connection at all, not because they did not look, but because there was nothing left to find that could clearly link their present to their past, and in those cases, identity became something constructed from fragments, pieces of memory, pieces of environment, pieces of expectation, assembled into something that functioned, but did not fully answer the question of where it began. And that is where the difficulty of this story remains, not in determining whether it was entirely good or entirely harmful, but in understanding that it was both, depending on where you look, and that for every example that suggests success, there is another that suggests something else entirely, something quieter, harder to define, and easier to overlook. Because what this system ultimately did was not simply move children from one place to another, it redistributed lives, it altered trajectories, it redefined belonging without asking for consent, and it did so in a way that made the outcomes appear individual, even though the mechanism behind them was collective. And when you look at it from that perspective, the question shifts. It is no longer about whether it worked or whether it failed, but about whether it understood what it was changing, and whether it ever accounted for the cost of changing it. Because for those who lived through it, the answer was never written clearly in records or reports. It was carried quietly in the way they lived, in the way they adapted, and in the parts of themselves that could not be easily explained even years later.